In this lesson, I want to talk about how do I add and subtract rational numbers. So I'm going to go over 4 examples, 2 addition and 2 subtraction problems with rational numbers. Before I do that, I want to make sure that you understand what rational numbers are. An integer is any number that's like a whole number, like 1, 2, 3, and 4, but it also includes all the negative numbers, like negative 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Rational numbers include not just your whole numbers, but also your fractions and decimals that can be represented. So those are called rational numbers, both positive and both your positives and negatives. So in this one, we have negative 5 and 3/5 plus 6 and 1/3. It is important to remember that when you're adding rational numbers, if the numbers have the same sign, then you add the numbers and the sign of the sum is the same as those numbers. That's not the case in these 2 problems, though. We have different signs, in which case if you have a different sign, you subtract the numbers and the sign is the same as the number with the higher absolute value. So when I look at these 2 numbers, I can tell you they're different signs, so I'm going to subtract them and find the difference, and I know that the negative 5 and 3/5 is going to be less absolute value than 6 and 1/3 because 5 is less than 6. So the absolute value of negative 5 3/5 is less. And again, we write absolute value like this. So we'd put those brackets around here. The absolute values there would be the 6 and 1/3 would be greater, so my answer is going to be positive. And then so the next step is just to add these fractions together, ignoring the signs. I'm sorry, not add. You're going to subtract the fractions, putting the larger one on top, and that's because we're adding, but they have different signs, so you want to make sure that you're going to subtract to find the difference. Yeah, that's what I said first. So let's go ahead and set that up. When you set this up, you always want to put the fraction with the higher absolute value on top so you can find the difference. That's why I put 6 and 1/3 above 5 and 3/5 because I knew it was greater. Now I'm going to give the fractions a common denominator so I can then add them. When I give these fractions a common denominator, I have 6 and 5/15 and 5 and 9/15 because my common denominator is 15, and I multiply the top fraction by 5/5 and the bottom fraction by 3/3. Now I need to subtract. And when I go to do, or now I need to subtract. So when I go to 5/15 minus 9/15, I don't have enough, so I have to regroup. To regroup, I'm going to basically take 15/15 away from the 6 and make it a 5. And I'm going to add those 15/15 in here to give me 20/15. Now I can do 20 minus 9 and get a difference of 11/15. And I can do 5 minus 5 and get a difference of 0. So my answer would be 11/15, which is actually already in simplest form, meaning that when I come up here and I go back to answering the original problem, negative 5 and 3/5 plus 6 and 1/3, my actual answer is going to be 11/15. And remember, that's going to be a positive 11/15 because the 6 and 1/3 had the higher absolute value. Here's another adding problem, but this time we're with decimals. Again, note that we don't have the same sign. If we had the same sign, we just add them together and we keep the sign the same. Since we have a different sign, we have to look at the absolute value, and we know that the absolute value of 7 and 3/4 is going to be 7. The absolute value of 7 and 34/100 is negative 7 and 34/100 is 7 34/100. This one's going to be 10.6. The 10 is greater than 7, so we know this will have the higher absolute value. My answer is going to be positive. Now, since I have different signs, I actually just need to subtract. When I subtract, I just need to make sure I line up my decimal points. This is much easier than subtracting the fractions. I'll have to extend this decimal out of place. When I'm subtracting, you actually put even think in your head, can you think 60 minus 34 and know what that is? I know 60 plus 40 is 100, so, or 30 is half of that. But anyways, let me just regroup. That'll be easier. 10, 5, 10 minus 4 is 6, 5 minus 3 is 2, bring down the decimal point, 10 minus 7, and that one is 3. All right, so 3.26 is my difference. In this case, since I have opposite signs, it's actually going to be my sum, and it's going to be a positive 3.26 because the 10.6 has a higher absolute value. Now let's talk about subtracting rational numbers. So in subtracting rational numbers, the rules are a little bit different. You might think of subtracting as the same as adding the opposite of the number you are subtracting. So if I start with negative 5 and 1/5 minus 6 and 2/3, I'm really adding a negative 6 and 2/3. So I'm adding a negative 6 and 2/3. And now I go to the addition rules. Oh, in the addition rules, if I have two numbers that are negative, I add them together and the sign will and the answer will still be negative. So in this case, I'm going to add 5 and 1/5 and 6 and 2/3, their absolute values, whatever my sum is, put a negative sign in front of it, and there's my answer. So I add 5 and 1/5 plus 6 and 2/3. I'm going to add those together. I'm going to need to now find a common denominator. So I found a common denominator of 15 by multiplying the top fraction by 3/3 and the bottom fraction by 5/5. Now I add my fractions. 3 15ths plus 10 15ths is 13 15ths. And 5 plus 6 is 11. 13 15ths can't be simplified, so my answer is going to be 11 and 13 15ths. However, I started out with two negatives, so it's going to have to be negative 11 and 13 15ths. So hopefully now you saw why we need to know the addition rules in order to subtract, because we're going to basically turn subtracting into addition and then use those addition rules. So again, in this case, when you subtract two numbers, it's the same as adding the opposite of the number I'm subtracting. So in this case, I'm doing negative 6 and 775 thousandths minus negative 1 and 7/10. So what I'm really going to be doing is adding a positive 1 and 7/10, which means that I have different signs. I look at now this number, 6, 1, 0. Okay, 6 is greater than 1, so that's going to be a negative. My answer is going to be negative, and since I have opposite signs, I have to subtract. 6.775 minus 1.700, and I need to set that up and subtract. 5 minus 0 is 5, 7 minus 0, bring down my decimal point, 5, so my answer is 5 and 75 thousandths. I come up here and write that. Notice I put the negative sign there first. Negative 5 and 75 thousandths, because the number of the two numbers I was adding was the one with the greater absolute value was negative. So negative 6 and 775 thousandths minus negative 1 and 7/10 equals negative 5 and 75 thousandths. So again, hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to add and subtract not just integers, but rational numbers.